In March 1953, Moscow was plunged into mourning. An endless stream of people filed through the column hall of the House of Unions where the leader's coffin had been placed. But behind the mournful facade, in the silence of the Kremlin offices, a drama of a different kind was unfolding. The vacuum left by Stalin's death could not remain unfilled. In this atmosphere of universal grief and hidden fear, when it seemed that time itself had stopped, one man acted with lightning speed and cold determination. That man was Lavrentiy Beria. Even before the official announcement of Stalin's death, he began to concentrate the levers of real power in his hands. His first and most important step was to merge two key security agencies, the Ministry of State Security, MGB, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs. On paper, it looked like a reorganization, but in essence it was the creation of a super-ministry, a real state within a state. Now under his personal control were not only the state security organs, foreign intelligence and border troops, but also the entire police force, internal troops, the Gulag camp system, the fire brigade, and even the civil registry archives. This was power comparable to that of Stalin himself, if not surpassing it. Beria, having taken the post of first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers and Minister of Internal Affairs, became a figure to be reckoned with. Imagine his office in Lubyanka in those days. The phones of the Vertushka, the government communication system, ring incessantly. Beria, wearing his usual pince-nez, gives short, precise orders. He does not raise his voice. His calmness is more frightening than any shout. He knows everything and everyone. In his safes lay thick folders of compromising material on each of his colleagues in the Presidium of the Central Committee: Malenkov, Khrushchev, Molotov, Bulganin. He feels like he is in control of the situation, and he has every reason to. He has begun to implement reforms. He initiated a broad amnesty, freeing more than 1 million people, mostly convicted of minor crimes, advocated for the cessation of costly construction projects, such as the main Turkmen Canal, and proposed a review of policy towards the GDR. These steps, which seemed progressive, only reinforced the suspicions of his colleagues. He was gaining popularity. He was acting in circumvention of the collective leadership. He was preparing to seize power. Among those who watched Beria's rise with growing concern, Nikita Khrushchev was the most active. Outwardly simple and even rough, he possessed a keen political instinct and extraordinary energy. He understood better than anyone else that if Beria was not stopped now, tomorrow would be too late. The power of the all-powerful minister was growing by the hour. Khrushchev began to act cautiously, like a sapper in a minefield. He did not convene official meetings. Instead, he began to hold private conversations, testing the waters. First with Nikolai Bulganin, the Minister of Defense. Then, having secured his support, he approached the formal head of government, Georgy Malenkov. The conversation with Malenkov was crucial. Malenkov was hesitant. He feared Beria, but he feared an open confrontation with him even more. Khrushchev pressed him, persuaded him, painted a bleak picture of the future, where they would all become mere puppets in the hands of the new dictator. He will shoot us all one by one like partridges, he might say, using his favorite folk comparisons. In the end, Malenkov, realizing that his own position was hanging by a thread, agreed. But political agreement was not enough. Beria controlled the Dzerzhinsky division stationed in Moscow and the entire Kremlin Guard. Any attempt to remove him by political means was doomed to failure. He would simply arrest all the conspirators. A force capable of countering Beria's power was needed. And there was only one such force in the country, the army. But the army obeyed orders. To give such an order, a person with unquestionable authority in the troops was needed, a person whose name was a symbol of victory. And such a person existed, Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. At that time, Zhukov held the post of First Deputy Minister of Defense of the USSR. After the war, he fell into disfavor and was sent to command secondary military districts. Only shortly before Stalin's death was he returned to Moscow. He was not part of the inner circle of rulers, but his influence in the army was enormous. It was to him that Khrushchev turned. It was the riskiest move in the entire conspiracy. If Zhukov had refused, or worse, reported everything to Beria, the fate of Khrushchev and his supporters would have been sealed. But Khrushchev's calculation was correct. As a career military man, Zhukov despised the organs and their methods. He saw what a threat Beria posed to the country and the army. His participation turned the political conspiracy into a carefully planned military operation. Thus began the formation of an alliance that would decide the fate of the country. On one side were party officials who feared for their power and their lives. On the other was the renowned marshal, ready to use the army to restore what he understood to be order. All the threads converged in one pair of hands, but the opponents were preparing their deadly noose. Could they, relying solely on the authority of one marshal and the shaky agreement of a few politicians, defeat the man who held the entire punitive apparatus of a huge country in his fist? The conversation between Khrushchev and Zhukov most likely took place not in the Kremlin office, where even the walls had ears, but at one of the dachas outside Moscow, perhaps during a walk in the woods. Here, among the birches and pines, it was possible to speak a little more freely. Khrushchev, gesticulating, painted a picture Beria, according to him, was preparing a coup. He was already placing his people in key positions, and his reforms were merely a smokescreen for seizing sole power. He also mentioned alarming signals from the GDR, where Beria's policy of German reunification threatened to undo all the gains of the war. For Zhukov, the man who had accepted the surrender in Berlin, this was not just a political argument, it was a personal insult, a negation of his entire life's work. But Khrushchev did not need to persuade the marshal for long. Zhukov had his own deeply personal scores to settle with Beria and his department. His memory helpfully brought up events from the recent past. First and foremost, the humiliating trophy case of 1946. At Stalin's personal behest, but carried out by Minister of State Security Abakumov, a man from Beria's system, an investigation was launched against the marshal. He was accused of illegally appropriating trophy property, of removing entire train cars full of furniture, paintings, and carpets from Germany. His dacha near Moscow was searched. Every item, every trinket counted. It was a show trial designed to put the overly popular commander in his place. Zhukov knew that behind Abakumov stood the shadow of Beria, who took pleasure in collecting compromising material on everyone, and on the Marshal of Victory in particular. Only Stalin's personal intervention saved him, replacing the tribunal with exile to the Odessa military district. But the humiliation remained. He who had saved Moscow and taken Berlin was portrayed as a common looter. There was also the aviators case, when Air Force Commander Marshal Novikov and Minister of Aviation Industry Sakharin were arrested and tortured on trumped-up charges. They were forced to testify against Zhukov in an attempt to link him to a conspiracy in the aviation industry. Zhukov understood that this was a system, a well-oiled machine for destroying people, and that it was Beria who was orchestrating this machine. For Zhukov, as for any professional military man, the intervention of the Chekists in the affairs of the army and the arrests of combat commanders were the highest form of state madness. The army and the state security organs had always existed in a state of cold antagonism. In every military unit, there was an osobist, a representative of the Smersh, and later the MGB, who monitored the commander, could cancel his orders, write a denunciation, and destroy his career and life. Zhukov hated this system of total surveillance and mistrust, and Beria was the living embodiment of this system. Therefore, when Khrushchev offered him to lead the military part of the operation, Zhukov agreed without hesitation. For him, it was not just a political intrigue. It was an opportunity to settle the score for past humiliation, protect the army from the all-powerful Chekist, and possibly save the country from a new wave of terror. His agreement was a combination of personal resentment and state calculation. He was not a politician, he was a soldier, and he saw an enemy that needed to be neutralized. "All right," he said to Khrushchev, according to the recollections of those involved, "there is such a scoundrel. It is high time he was arrested." From that moment on, the conspiracy gained a steel core. The plan of operation was developed in the strictest secrecy, in compliance with all the rules of military conspiracy. Zhukov brought in a small circle of generals and marshals who were absolutely loyal to him. The key figure was Colonel General, later Marshal, Kirill Moskalenko, commander of the Moscow Air Defense District. He was entrusted with the most responsible part, providing military support. The group also included General Pavel Batitsky, Colonel Leonid Brezhnev, then head of the political department of the Ministry of the Navy, Marshal of Artillery Moskalenko, and others. Each of them risked not only their careers but their lives. If they failed, they would face immediate arrest and execution on charges of military conspiracy. The main difficulty was that Beria controlled not only the internal troops but also the entire Kremlin security. A direct assault was impossible. Therefore, a cunning plan was devised. On D-Day, 26 June 1953, a meeting of the Presidium of the Council of Ministers was scheduled. The agenda was deliberately routine so as not to arouse suspicion. At this time, 2 Guard divisions, the Taman and Kantemirovsky, stationed near Moscow and loyal to the Army Command rather than the Ministry of Internal Affairs, were put on alert. Their commanders were given orders. At a prearranged signal, they were to immediately move into the capital and take control of key facilities: the Kremlin, buildings on Lubyanka, the telegraph office, and railway stations. Zhukov personally briefed the capture group. It included about 10 generals and senior officers. They did not have automatic weapons or grenades with them. All their weapons were personal pistols in the pockets of their civilian jackets. They were to enter the Kremlin under the guise of meeting participants and wait for a signal in Malenkov's reception room, adjacent to the meeting room. The signal was to be a prearranged phone call from Malenkov's office. Malenkov himself, as the chair, was to interrupt the meeting at a certain moment, bring charges against Beria, and press the call button. This was the weakest part of the plan. Everything depended on the courage and composure of Malenkov, who was terrified of Beria. One slip-up, one wrong look, and Beria might have suspected something. And his personal security detail, thugs loyal to him, were just a few steps away in the corridor. The morning of 26 June was warm and sunny in Moscow. The city went about its usual business. No one suspected the drama unfolding behind the Kremlin walls. Members of the Presidium gathered for a meeting. Beria arrived, confident and wearing a light summer suit. He felt like he was in control of the situation. He did not know that the trucks he may have seen on the road, carrying cabbage and potatoes to Moscow markets, were actually hiding soldiers in full combat gear under tarpaulins. The meeting began. They discussed some current issues in agriculture. The atmosphere in the hall was electrified to the limit. Khrushchev, Bulganin, Molotov, everyone tried to behave as usual, but their stiff movements and tense faces gave them away. Only Beria was calm. He was writing something in his notebook, occasionally interjecting. Malenkov, pale as a sheet, struggled to chair the meeting. His hands were visibly shaking. Finally, he reached the agreed point. Stumbling over his words, he said, "There is a proposal to consider the question of Comrade Beria." A dead silence fell over the room. Beria looked up from his notebook, his eyes behind his pince-nez glasses staring at Malenkov in surprise and question. "What is it, Georgy? What other questions?" he asked with icy calm. And at that moment, Malenkov, summoning all his willpower, pressed the coveted button on his desk. The door swung open, and Zhukov entered the room with a quick, heavy gait. Behind him were Moskalenko, Batitsky, and other military officers. They instantly spread out, cutting off Beria's path to the exit. Beria jumped up. His face was contorted with rage and incomprehension. "What's going on? What's happening here?" he shouted. Zhukov approached him closely. His face was stony and inscrutable. Looking straight into the eyes of the all-powerful minister, he gave a short, sharp command that has become legendary. "I suggest you stand up. You are under arrest." According to another version, the phrase was even shorter and harsher. "Hands up, scoundrel." Beria tried to reach for the briefcase lying on the table. Perhaps there was a weapon in it, or perhaps he was simply acting on instinct. But Zhukov was quicker. With a powerful movement, he grabbed Beria's arms and twisted them behind his back. The generals immediately surrounded him. Moskalenko pulled a pistol from Beria's pocket. The resistance was broken in a matter of seconds. Stunned and humiliated, Beria, still not believing what was happening, croaked, addressing Malenkov, "Georgy, I saved you!" But Malenkov, who had already come to his senses, just turned away in disgust. The arrested man was led through a side door into the reception room, and from there to the inner courtyard of the Kremlin, where a car was already waiting. He was not taken to Lubyanka or Lefortovo prison. That was too dangerous, as they were flooded with his people. He was secretly taken to the underground bunker of the Moscow Air Defense District headquarters on Kirov Street, now Myasnitskaya Street. There, in a damp concrete casemate, the career of one of the most powerful figures of the Stalin era came to an end. At the same time, troops were already entering Moscow. Tanks of the Taman Division took up positions near the Ministry of Internal Affairs building on Dzerzhinsky Square. Soldiers blocked all entrances and exits. The ministry's leadership, including Beria's closest associates, was arrested right in their offices without having time to offer any resistance. The operation was carried out brilliantly, quickly, precisely, and with virtually no bloodshed. The army demonstrated who was the real power in the country. For Zhukov, it was a moment of triumph. He had not simply carried out an order. He had personally, with his own hands, overthrown a man whom he considered an enemy of the army and the state. He had taken revenge for the trophy affair, for the humiliation, for his arrested comrades. In this single action, the harsh capture, the hands bent behind his back, the cold calculation of a statesman eliminating a dangerous competitor, merged with a deeply personal, almost animalistic sense of satisfaction from the revenge that had been accomplished. He acted not as a politician weaving intrigues, but as a commander on the battlefield. He identified the main threat, concentrated his forces, and delivered one decisive blow. Subsequent events only confirmed the correctness of his calculation. At an emergency plenary session of the CPSU Central Committee, Khrushchev delivered a report entitled "On Beria's Criminal Anti-Party and Anti-State Activities." Yesterday's comrades in arms, who until recently had been afraid to raise their eyes to him, now vied with each other to brand him a spy, a careerist, a moral monster, and an enemy of the people. The trial, which took place in December of the same year, was swift and predetermined. A special court of the Supreme Court of the USSR, chaired by Marshal Konev, sentenced Beria and his closest associates to the highest penalty, execution by firing squad. The sentence was carried out immediately, according to the official version, by General Batitsky, the same man who had participated in the arrest. So what was it, revenge or calculation? History does not provide a simple answer, because in the motives of great men, the personal and the public are often so closely intertwined that it is impossible to separate them. Undoubtedly, Zhukov felt a deep personal animosity towards Beria, and the opportunity to settle the score for the past was a powerful incentive for him.
But at the same time, he acted as a statesman who saw Beria's rise as a mortal threat to a country that was just beginning to recover from decades of fear. A threat of a new, possibly even more terrible wave of repression in which the army could be one of the first victims. His cold calculation was that by supporting Khrushchev's group, he would not only eliminate this threat, but also restore the army to its rightful place in the hierarchy of power, strengthening its prestige and his own position. And he was not mistaken. In February 1955, Marshal Zhukov became Minister of Defense of the USSR, concentrating enormous power in his hands. He had reached the peak of his post-war career. However, as history would show, he did not remain at this peak for long. Political games in the Kremlin continued, and yesterday's allies in the fight against Beria very soon became his new opponents. But that is a completely different story. On that June day in 1953, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Marshal of the Soviet Union, put an end to Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria's career, and in doing so, personal revenge and cold calculation became two sides of the same coin, the coin of victory in a ruthless struggle for power. It is worth taking a closer look at the reforms that Beria began with such feverish haste. They were not chaotic. They followed a clear logic that was frightening to his opponents. Take, for example, the German question. With access to all intelligence data, Beria understood better than anyone else that building socialism in East Germany was an unbearable burden for the Soviet economy and a source of constant tension in Europe. His proposal was radical and shocking to party orthodoxy. To abandon the course of creating the GDR as a socialist state and enter into negotiations with the West on the creation of a unified but neutral and demilitarized Germany. From a pragmatic point of view, it was a strong move that would have lifted a huge burden from the USSR. But to his colleagues, whose thinking was shaped by ideology and the outcome of the war, it looked like a monstrous betrayal. To give up what had cost millions of lives? To allow a unified Germany to be reborn, even if it was neutral? It was tantamount to treason. Khrushchev and others immediately seized on this, portraying Beria as a capitulator, ready to sell off the gains of victory. His famous amnesty was no less ambiguous. The release of more than 1 million prisoners from the Gulag camps was presented as an act of humanism, and for many it was. But there was another side to this coin. The amnesty did not apply to those convicted under Article 58, the political article. Those released were mainly criminals, petty thieves, and those convicted of minor thefts and official crimes. The country was swept by a wave of crime that went down in history as the cold summer of '53. The cities were filled with former prisoners who had neither housing nor work. This caused discontent among the population. Beria's enemies did not fail to take advantage of this, whispering in their offices that he was deliberately destabilizing the situation in the country so that later, as a savior, he could restore order with an iron fist. In addition, by initiating a review of fabricated cases, such as the doctor's case or the Mingrelian case, Beria affected the interests of many influential figures in the party apparatus and state security organs who were themselves involved in these repressions. He made enemies at all levels by acting too straightforwardly and disregarding the corporate solidarity of the Soviet elite. In this tense atmosphere, the figure of Georgy Malenkov, the formal head of state, was particularly tragic. His relationship with Beria was a complex mixture of long-standing cooperation and mortal fear. They were fellow countrymen, both rose to prominence under Stalin, and often acted in tandem. But Malenkov, unlike Beria, possessed neither his will nor his cruelty. He was a typical apparatchik, a master of backroom intrigue, but he deferred to open force. Beria knew everything about him and kept him on a short leash. After Stalin's death, Malenkov found himself in an ambiguous position. He was the head of state, but everyone understood that Beria held the real power. It was this fear and humiliation that Khrushchev used as his main lever, convincing Malenkov that Beria despised him and would destroy him at the first opportunity. The decision to press the call button for Malenkov was not just a political choice, but an act of overcoming his own paralyzing fear. We should not forget the role of the army as an institution. Hatred of the state security organs was almost universal in military circles. Every commander, from lieutenant to marshal, lived under the sword of Damocles wielded by the Osobista, special services. The post-war purges, which affected many combat generals, only reinforced this animosity. The Leningrad affair, during which the head of the State Planning Committee, Voznesensky, was shot, also affected many military personnel associated with the besieged Leningrad. The army felt humiliated. The Chekists, who were contemptuously called rear rats at the front, raised their heads again after the war and told the combat generals how to live and serve. Therefore, when Zhukov sounded the call, the army leadership responded with enthusiasm. This was not just a conspiracy by a small group of individuals. It was corporate revenge by the entire officer corps on a system that had kept it in fear for decades. The marshals and generals who participated in the arrest acted not only out of loyalty to Zhukov, but also out of a deep conviction that they were saving the army from a new round of repression. Immediately after his arrest, Beria was taken to the bunker. General Moskalenko and his most trusted officers were personally entrusted with his guard. They were given orders, in the event of any attempt to free the arrested man, to shoot him on the spot. The conspirators understood that as long as Beria was alive, the danger had not passed. His people could try to rescue their boss. For the first few days, Moscow lived in a state of covert martial law. Army patrols controlled the streets, and key buildings were placed under heavy guard. The political purge culminated in the July 1953 plenum of the Central Committee. The atmosphere in the hall was heavy and tense. Many of those present had been fawning over Beria just a week earlier, and now they had to condemn him. The transcript of the plenum is a unique document that captures the psychology of fear and betrayal. The speakers, from members of the Presidium to secretaries of regional committees, competed in denouncing yesterday's idol. He was accused of everything: spying for England since the Civil War, attempting to restore capitalism, moral decay, and careerism. They recalled every careless word he had uttered, every gesture he had made. Molotov, who himself had nearly fallen victim to Beria's repressions, delivered one of the most vehement speeches. This plenum was not a court of law, but a ritual act of collective self-justification and shifting the responsibility for all the crimes of the Stalin era onto one man. Beria was designated as the main and sole culprit of the terror, which allowed the other members of the leadership to whitewash themselves in the eyes of the party and the people. The investigation into Beria's case was conducted by the USSR's Prosecutor General Roman Rudenko, the same man who was the chief prosecutor for the USSR at the Nuremberg trials. This was symbolic. The internal enemy was equated with external enemies. The charges were absurd, but that no longer mattered. For example, his connection with British intelligence was based on dubious testimony given back in the 1920s. But the machinery of justice had been set in motion, and no one was going to stop it.
Along with Beria, his closest associates found themselves in the dock. Merkelov, Dekhanozov, Kobulov, Goglidze, Meshik, Vladzimirsky, the entire leadership of the punitive organs. It was a show trial of the entire system he headed. They were not tried for actual crimes, mass repression, torture, falsification of cases, but on a standard set of espionage and conspiracy charges. Admitting their actual guilt would have meant admitting the criminal nature of the entire regime, which Khrushchev and his entourage could not do. Zhukov's role in this whole story was unique. He was not a politician, but it was his decisive actions that made the political decision possible. He acted as a guarantor, the strong arm of the conspiracy. His authority was so great that his mere presence paralyzed the will of Beria's supporters in the security forces. No one dared to oppose the Marshal of Victory. This was his cold calculation. He understood perfectly well that he was indispensable in this particular situation and exploited it to the full. He did not simply settle personal scores. He acted as a surgeon, removing a malignant tumor that threatened the entire body. And like a surgeon, he acted without emotion, with cold precision. Beria's fall had far-reaching consequences. The all-powerful Ministry of Internal Affairs was immediately broken up. The state security organs were transferred to a separate structure, the Committee for State Security, KGB, under the Council of Ministers, and placed under strict party control. Never again in Soviet history did the special services wield such unlimited power as they did under Beria. The army, on the contrary, sharply increased its influence. For a time, Marshal Zhukov became one of the key figures in the state, a true kingmaker. It was his support that helped Khrushchev defeat the anti-party group of Molotov, Malenkov, and Kaganovich in 1957. But as is often the case, the victor in the fight against the dragon risks becoming a dragon himself. The strengthening of Zhukov and the army began to frighten Khrushchev himself. And just a few months after the defeat of the anti-party group, he used the same method, accusing the Marshal of Bonapartism and seeking to remove the army from party control, and dismissed him. The circle was complete. Zhukov, who had played a key role in eliminating one political rival, himself fell victim to political intrigue. His calculation proved correct in the short term, but in the long game of Kremlin power, he, as a soldier, proved weaker than the seasoned apparatchiks. The final push that turned the muffled grumbling into a determination to act came from events unfolding far beyond the Garden Ring, in the very heart of Europe. On 17 June 1953, a popular uprising broke out in East Berlin. German workers, outraged by increased production quotas, took to the streets. Very soon, economic slogans were replaced by political ones. Down with the government, free elections, reunification of Germany. Soviet troops had to use force, including tanks, to suppress the uprising. For Kremlin conservatives, this was a clear and terrifying confirmation of the failure of Beria's policies. It was he who insisted on liberalizing the course in the GDR, on softening the regime. And here was the result, an open rebellion that nearly led to the loss of control over a key satellite in Europe. In the eyes of his opponents, this was not just a mistake, but a direct consequence of his adventurism, bordering on treason. The fuse to the powder keg had been lit, and Khrushchev had his main irrefutable trump card. Beria's actions threatened not only stability within the USSR, but also the entire post-war world order. The time for persuasion and doubt was over. It is interesting to follow the behavior of other members of the Presidium, such as Vyacheslav Molotov. His wife, Polina Zhemchuzhina, was arrested in 1949 with the active participation of Beria and sent into exile. Molotov, then Minister of Foreign Affairs, not only failed to stand up for her, but was forced to publicly condemn her at party meetings in order to save his own skin. One of Beria's first steps after Stalin's death was to release Zhemchuzhina and bring her back to Moscow. It would seem that Molotov should have been grateful. But the psychology of the old Bolsheviks was much more complex. This act of mercy on the part of a man who had been his executioner only yesterday was perceived by Molotov as a subtle humiliation, a demonstration of power. Beria seemed to be saying to him, "Look, I can execute you, and I can pardon you. Your fate and the fate of your family are in my hands." Such gratitude only fueled Molotov's hatred, mixing it with a sense of shame for his own past powerlessness.
Therefore, when Khrushchev came to him with a proposal to remove Beria, Molotov, without hesitation, supported the conspiracy, motivated not only by political calculation, but also by a deeply personal desire to take revenge for years of fear and shame. Returning to the figure of Zhukov, it is worth taking a deeper look at the nature of his cold calculation. It was not just a matter of protecting the army from repression. The Marshal thought in terms of national security in the broadest sense. A key element of this security was the Soviet atomic project. From the very beginning, Beria was appointed its curator by the Politburo. He was an effective, albeit cruel, manager who managed to create the country's nuclear shield in the shortest possible time. But for professional military men, and for Zhukov in particular, the situation where strategic weapons capable of deciding the fate of the world were under the complete control of the head of the secret services was absolutely abnormal and extremely dangerous. The army, which was supposed to use these weapons, was essentially removed from control over them. Zhukov understood that a man who controlled both the punitive apparatus and the atomic bomb had absolute power over which both the party and the army were powerless. In this context, the elimination of Beria was not simply the elimination of a competitor, but a strategic operation to return control of the country's main military resource to the state and its armed forces. It was the calculation of a strategist thinking decades ahead, not a tactician. Immediately after the arrest, when Beria was already in the bunker, the most tense period began. Information about what had happened was strictly classified. Moscow went about its usual business, but in the corridors of power there was an atmosphere of near panic. The conspirators feared a counterattack from Beria's powerful ministry. Only a few days later, on 10 July, the newspaper Pravda published a short news item about the Central Committee plenum, which removed LP Beria from the Central Committee and expelled him from the party as an enemy of the Communist Party and the Soviet people. There was no mention of his arrest or details of the charges. This terse statement gave rise to a flood of rumors and speculation. For millions of people accustomed to seeing Beria on the podium of the mausoleum alongside Stalin, this news came as a bolt from the blue. Complete confusion reigned in the local offices of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of State Security. No one understood what was happening or whose orders to follow. This information blockade was part of the plan. It allowed the conspirators to gain time to arrest Beria's key supporters throughout the country and completely paralyze his power structure, preventing it from recovering and organizing resistance. The purge was not limited to Beria and his immediate circle. Immediately after his fall, a large-scale purge began in the state security.
Organs. Dozens of generals and senior officers of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of State Security were arrested and subsequently shot. Thousands of employees throughout the Union were dismissed, stripped of their ranks and awards. This was not just a change of leadership, but a deliberate destruction of the system of total control that Beria had built up over the years. A kind of Pandora's box was opened. Facts about monstrous crimes, torture, and fabricated cases began to surface. Khrushchev and his team used this to further demonize Beria, turning him into a scapegoat for all the sins of the Stalin era. However, there was an element of irony in this. Many of the ideas that Beria was accused of as revisionist and anti-party, criticism of the cult of personality, rehabilitation of the wrongfully convicted, normalization of relations with Yugoslavia, seeking dialogue with the West, were adopted by Khrushchev himself just a couple of years later and formed the basis of his thaw policy. It turned out that Beria was tried and shot not so much for his crimes as for the fact that he had begun to do what others had not yet dared to do, and had done so too quickly, too roughly, and too dangerously for their own power. Immediately after Beria was led out of the courtroom, the second, equally important part of the operation began, the seizure of his personal archives. The conspirators understood that arresting Beria was only half the battle.
The main source of his power was not the divisions, but the steel safes in his mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya and on Lubyanka, filled with folders containing compromising information on every member of the leadership. A special group acting on the orders of Khrushchev and Bulganin immediately sealed these premises. The fate of these archives remains largely unclear. It is believed that most of them were destroyed in order to bury forever the secrets that could have blown up the entire party leadership. This struggle to destroy the past was also evident in the details of the execution itself. The sentence was carried out by General Pavel Batitsky, who had personally participated in the arrest. According to a widely circulated and documented version, he used his personal award pistol, a Walther. This gesture was deeply symbolic. It was not a faceless NKVD executioner, but a combat general, a representative of the army, who put an end to it all. It was not simply the execution of a sentence, but an act of retribution on behalf of all those who had suffered at the hands of the all-powerful agency. Every participant in the conspiracy walked on a knife's edge until the very last moment. The neutralization of Beria's personal guard, led by Colonel Sarkisov, was carried out with surgical precision. The slightest mistake, and Beria's loyal officers could have raised the alarm, leading to bloodshed in the very heart of the Kremlin. It was a deadly risk, justified not only by fear for their own lives, but also by the understanding that they were dismantling not just a man, but an entire system of power built on blackmail and total surveillance. Based on reliable facts, Zhukov's actions against Beria were dictated primarily by political calculation and the implementation of a decision by a party group led by Khrushchev. Personal animosity, if it existed at all, played a secondary role in this large-scale confrontation. This event became a key moment in the struggle for power after Stalin, reminding us of the complexity and cruelty of political games among the Soviet elite.